On the night of December 16th, 1773, a group of men smeared their faces with coal dust and grease, pulled on blankets, and quietly boarded 3 ships sitting in Boston Harbor. Then they spent 3 hours smashing open 342 wooden chests and hurling every last one of them into the cold, black water below. The cargo was worth about 10,000 pounds, roughly $2 million today. And the strange part, the part that changes everything, is that they were not angry because tea was too expensive. They were angry because it had become too cheap. How a price drop on tea helped light the fuse of a revolution is one of the strangest turns in American history. To understand it, you have to go back about a decade. Britain had just fought a massive, globe-spanning conflict called the 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763. Britain won, but winning cost an enormous amount of money. The British government was deep in debt and looking everywhere for ways to raise cash. Its American colonies seemed like a reasonable place to start. After all, Britain argued, the war had partly been fought to protect those very colonies from French expansion in North America. So Parliament, the lawmaking body in London, began passing a series of new taxes aimed at Americans. The problem was that Americans had no seats in Parliament. They had no voice in these decisions. They could not vote for or against the people making these laws. And to many colonists, that felt like a fundamental injustice. They coined a phrase that spread fast: no taxation without representation. It became a rallying cry, the idea that a government has no right to take your money if you have no say in that government. The taxes came one after another. The Stamp Act in 1765 taxed paper documents. The Townshend Acts in 1767 taxed glass, paper, paint, and tea. Each one sparked protests. Colonists organized boycotts, refusing to buy British goods at all. British merchants, losing money fast, pressured Parliament to back down. Most of the Townshend taxes were eventually repealed, but Parliament kept the tea tax on purpose, just to make the point that it still had the right to tax the colonies whenever it chose. Now here is where it gets strange. By 1773, the British East India Company, the giant trading corporation that controlled most of Britain's commerce with Asia, was on the verge of collapse. It had warehouses stuffed with millions of pounds of unsold tea. The company was too big to fail, in the language of today, and Parliament needed to save it. So Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773. The Tea Act did something unusual. It gave the East India Company the right to ship tea directly to the American colonies, cutting out the middlemen who normally handled the trade. This actually made tea cheaper for American buyers. On the surface, it looked like a good deal for colonists. But colonial merchants who had built their businesses selling tea were suddenly being undercut and pushed out entirely. And more importantly, the tax that Parliament had kept from the Townshend Acts was still embedded in the price. Cheap tea still came with a tax that colonists had never agreed to pay. For many Americans, this felt like a trap, a way of bribing them into quietly accepting Parliament's authority over their lives and wallets. If they bought the cheap tea, they accepted the principle that Britain could tax them without their consent. That, for the more politically minded colonists, was unacceptable regardless of the price. Boston became the flashpoint. 3 ships carrying East India Company tea arrived in the harbor in late November 1773. Local leaders tried to send the ships back to England without unloading. The royal governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, refused. He ordered the ships to stay and the tea to be landed and taxed. A political standoff locked the situation in place for weeks. Then came the night of December 16th. A crowd of several thousand people gathered at the Old South Meeting House in Boston to hear the final answer from the governor. The answer was no. The ships would not leave. A signal was given. Around 116 men, some of them members of a group called the Sons of Liberty, a loose political organization opposed to British taxation, made their way to the docks. They wore rough disguises, mostly to avoid being identified and prosecuted afterward. They divided into 3 groups, one for each ship, and they worked through the night with military efficiency, hauling up heavy chests, splitting them open with hatchets, and dumping the contents into the harbor. They were careful not to damage the ships themselves or steal anything. When it was done, they swept the decks clean. Nearly 46 tons of tea floated in Boston Harbor by morning. The event would later be called the Boston Tea Party, a name that almost makes it sound cheerful, though nothing about what followed was. Britain's response was swift and hard. Parliament passed a package of laws in 1774 that Americans immediately called the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston was shut down entirely, strangling the city's economy. Massachusetts lost much of its self-governing power. British officials accused of crimes in the colonies could now be tried back in England, far from local juries, and colonists were required to house and feed British soldiers if ordered to. The Intolerable Acts were meant to isolate Massachusetts and frighten the other colonies into compliance. Instead, they did the opposite. Colonies that had been divided and cautious began to see themselves as sharing the same danger. Representatives from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia in September 1774 for the First Continental Congress, coordinating a united response for the first time. Tension built through the winter. British soldiers and colonial militias eyed each other across Massachusetts. Then, on April 19, 1775, British troops marched out to seize colonial weapons stored at Concord, a town west of Boston. They clashed with local militiamen first at Lexington and then at Concord. Shots were fired. Men died on both sides. The American Revolutionary War had begun. So the thread runs clearly from debt to taxes to a dropped tea price that felt like a trick, to a night of men with hatchets on a freezing harbor, to a war that produced the United States of America. Tea did not start the revolution by itself. The causes were deep and had been building for years. But that one shipment, those 342 chests, became the moment that made retreat impossible for both sides. We still argue about versions of the same question today. When does a government cross a line in what it asks of the people it governs? And what gives ordinary people the right to refuse? The colonists in Boston gave one answer in 1773. Whether that answer was right, whether the destruction of private property and the path it opened were justified by what followed, that is still genuinely open for debate. So what do you think? Were the colonists right to dump that tea, or did they cross a line that night in Boston Harbor? Tell me in the comments. And if stories like this are your thing, subscribe, because the next one is already on its way.